welcome back to Towards Regulation of Nanomaterials. I'm very excited to introduce a host of speakers this afternoon, all of them very distinguished in the area of nanomaterials. Our first speaker is Dr. Freiman. He basically he hails from NIST up till about 2006 or so, where he was Deputy Director of Material Science and Engineering there. Since then, he started his own company, Freiman Consulting. Dr. Freiman has published over 150 papers in the areas focused mainly on mechanical properties of very brittle materials. He's a fellow and distinguished life member of the American Ceramic Society, and he served as chair in that Society of Glass and Optical Materials Division. This afternoon, Dr. Freiman is going to speak on measurement needs for nano environmental health and safety. Thank you. Steve.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to this group. And I look forward to this talk particularly because I look forward to some discussion afterwards. What I'm going to try and do is sort of give the lay of the land with respect to measurement needs, talk a bit about some thoughts I've had and issues that maybe you all haven't considered so much when it comes to measurements, and hopefully develop some conversations about what the real measurement needs might be. I mean, that's how I think about, since a former NIST person kind of thinks of measurements all the time anyway. That's how we maybe. But I was also sensitive to a lot of discussion early on about regulations will happen whether we like it or not. So we better be prepared to give the regulators the kind of data, information, and so forth that enable them to do a good job as opposed to doing a job that we just won't be happy with afterwards. So with that in mind, the way I want to have structured things is to sort of start out by talking about, well, what is the problem? And I think there is a problem when it comes to measurements. Talk about a list that I've compiled over the past couple of years. As you all know, there have been numbers of workshops in this area of nano-EHS, and people have expressed opinions about what they think the priority in measurement needs is, and I want to show you some of that. Give you a feel of what's going on, many of you know, in what I call the standardization activities, both nationally and internationally. And then talk some, which is kind of maybe the fun part for me, and a few issues to consider when we think about these measurements. And I have come across what to me is a new interesting measurement technique that may help us go from where we are now to where we need to be to provide the safety of these materials that we're interested in, and then finally just summarize. So with that in mind, I have always liked this quotation, "To measure is to know," from Kelvin. But the question is, well, what are we supposed to be measuring? We have to measure something, and when it comes to nanomaterials, as I go along, I'll express some question as to what the measurements ought to be, but that's hopefully part of the discussion we will have later. And then, of course, if I measure these things, will it make us safer? Are they the right measurements? And so these are questions that will hopefully permeate some of the discussion that I bring up and that will come up later on. So I told Chuck that I would take one of his slides that he gave at a workshop that I put together a few years ago. You all have seen all of this, but you appreciate, when you see this, the expanse of the nanomaterial world and what it is going to take to measure everything that we need with respect to all of these things, and probably a lot more that have occurred since then. The other issue, of course, and all of you have seen some of these, is that not only are they all the chemistries and shapes and sizes and so forth, so we can't do it all at once, and some of this discussion has gone on now. Well, what are the most important nanomaterials today? What do we need to start on, and so forth? I particularly like this, and I think you'll hear some of this later from Mark, but this in one of the workshops, particularly with these startup companies, the first people who are going to be exposed to nanomaterials are the workers who are making these things, and of course university professors and students who are doing the research in there. And I thought it was important that somebody was willing to speak up and say, you must have a situation where nobody is harmed, and that if you make a mistake, you may lose your company. So these become serious, and that's why it is important to know, well, what are the harmful aspects of some of the materials that we're looking at? I'm going to run through now, as I said, a few of the measurement needs that have arisen over, say, the past 1 to 2 years. And I will be interested at the end of the presentation during the discussion period if there's some that you would say, no, we don't really need to do that, but here's what we need to do instead. So these are really pretty much my ideas on what I have seen with some help from some of my colleagues. So we've heard a lot about particle size, particle shape distributions. I doubt that people would argue too much that this is going to be important. Particle surface chemistry in solution. What solutions? Well, that's an interesting question, right? Bodily fluids, inorganic solutions, or so forth. But it's a general term. Clearly, and maybe this one ought to be at the top, interaction of particles with biological systems. That's such a huge topic, though. What does that mean? Which biological system and which particles? But again, it kind of describes the broad aspect of measurement. And toxicity studies. And the key here, I think, what I'd like to point out is well-characterized system. That is, materials who have some pedigree. If we're doing interlaboratory studies, that everybody's doing it on the same material. We've heard some concern over the past couple of days of studies being done and where we're not quite sure that material A looks like material B, or we can't reproduce that material. So that's a pretty critical aspect of these kind of studies. There's been a lot of discussion over many workshops and so forth of databases. That is, once we learn something, how do we put it in a format so that others can use it readily, can exchange their data on whatever property they're measuring with me, or I can exchange with them. And so the databases and data exchange formats, that can be a very daunting task. We were having a discussion yesterday of how much data is generated at any given time on nanomaterials, and it's very large. A few more of these. Measurement guides, measurement protocols and guides for the non-expert. I personally like this a great deal. We have to recognize that many of the people who are and will work in this field are not expert chemists. They are not PhDs. They need to measure things, but they need to understand what the pluses and minuses of a technique and where things can go wrong. And so what I call, and I'll show later, a guide to practice that isn't a standard, because standards are written in a strange kind of language at times, but enable the non-expert in a field to do the kind of measurements that need to be done. I think modeling techniques so as to be able to predict what we think will happen. There are too many experiments to be done to do them all. We need some guidance in the beginning to tell us where we should go, what's going to be critical, and what we should expect. So what particles, what solutions, and so forth. So modeling and computation, I think, needs to be accentuated in this kind of field. Again, this was something that came out of a workshop a couple of years ago, and that is there was a plea made that if I'm a small company or I need to make measurements outside of my laboratory, I need portable, inexpensive instrumentation so I can get these measurements done easily. And Chuck may follow up on that later on things that he talks about. But I thought I was sensitive to that kind of topic as well. And then there was some mention made early on in this workshop that there's an awful lot of nanoparticles out there. There are diesel emissions and so forth. And the question is, how do we detect what we call man-made nanoparticles against a background of all of these other nanoparticles? So this represents kind of a broad spectrum of measurements. It isn't all of them, and that's why I say I think there could be a good discussion of which of these, or do they go far enough. Let me talk a bit now about the standards business. And most of you probably recognize what these things are, but there are different kinds of models. So there are what we call the ISO model, which is a very formal process, probably you know. In the International Standards Organization, a country has a vote. It is not the individual, and therefore, because it's a country vote, it can become political. People like the ISO standards, they, in my mind, are more recognized as the international standard to be used, as opposed to ASTM, which thinks of itself as an international standard, but hasn't quite matched the ISO model, I think, in terms. So they sometimes feel a bit left out of this international standards business. But it's a different model because in ASTM, committees have technical experts that comment and vote on the standards themselves. So there's much more direct technical input into the ASTM model. And having served on both ASTM and ISO in a place where things work pretty smoothly in the ceramics community, where actually we went from ASTM standards and synchronized our ASTM standards with Japanese standards and European standards in the same topic and kind of negotiated the way, but they had a lot of technical background that went before then, which made for a good way to progress in getting something done. And then there are other corporate participation models. There are other standards developing organizations which have a wide range of processes and procedures, but there's an awful lot going on, and I will run fairly rapidly in the next few slides just to show you, most of which you probably have seen, of what is happening. So within ISO there is, and it's been mentioned here, TC 229 on nanotechnology, and within that there are working groups and task groups within that focused on health, safety, and environment. Angela Hite-Walker is at NIST, and from her I got a number of these background on measurement and characterization needs for EHS. So there, just to point out, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, there is work going on within ISO in developing measurement needs relative to environmental health and safety. Within ASTM, the relevant committee is E56, and the current chair of that committee also comes from NIST. Her name is Dr. Deborah Kaiser, and I won't have you read all this, but if you look, there are two subcommittees within that devoted to nano-EHS and relative to characterization and physical chemistry, and then environmental health and safety directly. So there is work going on here to develop standards as well. And there have been, and I don't expect you to read this, you can go to ASTM, just to point out things have gotten done. These are some of the standards that have been developed over the past few years. So there are things happening within this. And there is a real attempt now, I can say, to coordinate and collaborate between the activities in ISO and those in ASTM. Personally, I think it would be a shame to have this competition when we need so much work done. There is enough work to be done to divide this up that we don't have to have turf battles. And I'm pleased that I think agreements are being made and there's an attempt being made to work together to facilitate getting work done more rapidly. There's also this organization called the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and there's an ongoing international effort there to share testing, and I'll just briefly show you some of the topics that are going on there. If you want to see more on what they're doing, here's their website, and I suggest you go there and look to see. There's an awful lot of detail. They have published a number of reports dealing with manufactured nanomaterials, and those of you who are interested can go and download these kinds of things. So in these kind of formal, what I call formal standards, there's a great deal going on. There's also what I think of as pre-standards activities. There's this organization which I've been involved with for many years called the Versailles Project on Advanced Materials and Standards, we call VAMAS, and the mission here has been to support world trade in products dependent on advanced materials, et cetera, et cetera. It's a little over 25 years old now, and it does what I call pre-normative interlaboratory research. So there are technical working areas within VAMAS where there are laboratories from all over the world who work together to develop the methodology, the measurement protocol that will eventually lead into the formal standardization process. And in fact, there are two technical working areas here that are directly addressing nanomaterials, one on airborne nanoparticles, one on single-wall carbon nanotubes. Actually, there's a third one on TiO2 as well. So this is a kind of organization that is more an informal, a collegial group and it's supported by ministries in the different countries, so it's a fairly high-level organization, but it is not formal in the sense of developing binding standards. The idea is to develop the understanding and the test method itself and have an agreed-upon test method that's ready to move to formal standardization. I mentioned this idea of having something now for the non-expert. And this is simply one representative idea of what at NIST is called a practice guide, but other organizations like the National Physical Laboratory in Britain have similar kinds of things. I'm a great believer in the idea that we need to tell people what we know now, even though we are not, in fact, we're sure we don't know everything that needs to be known to do this, but it's the best we can do now, and here's today how we think you should make these measurements. And if you wait until you know everything, we'll never get it done. And so guides like this, and there are other ways to do it, I think will be particularly valuable to move the technology along. The other thing that's going on are reference materials, and you've heard them discussed a bit during this workshop. Some of those that are particularly pertinent to the nanotechnology effort, there are relatively new set of gold nanomaterial standards from NIST. I think they're 10, 30, and 60 nanometer particles. And we're in the process at NIST of developing single-wall carbon nanotube SRMs as well. In fact, we're going to have a fourth in our series of nanotube workshops in September, and there will be a VAMAS TWA that comes in and discusses their round-robin activities, and hopefully out of that will come a new reference material. But there are any number of reference materials that are possible. Some already exist. Some will be worked on in the near future. But I believe after saying all this is kind of in a rough idea where we stand now. But I see a couple of problems that I'd like to talk about with you, and hopefully we'll get some discussion on. First, as I mentioned earlier, are the measurements we make on these inorganic particles or nanotubes or quantum dots really going to lead to an understanding of the hazard? And second one that I will talk about is what is the role of measurement uncertainty when we say we have a risk with respect to these materials? So let me address the first one, and it's one that came about as at certain discussions at other nanotube meetings, and that is crystalline silica. And many of you are familiar with the hazards of silicosis, but the thing that always intrigued me, and this is a quote from a relatively new publication, 2007, saying that despite the substantial volume of research since the early 1950s, and probably before, since silicosis has been around much before then, we don't understand why it works. We don't understand the mechanism. That doesn't give you a lot of confidence that with these myriad of nanoparticles that we're going to find out how they work anytime soon. But despite that, we have to find a way to protect ourselves against it. And just to go on a bit, because it's been fascinating to me, I was involved a bit in putting on workshops in this when I was still at NIST. But this, to me, is what do I measure with respect to silica that tells me something about how I should expect it to react with tissue or with the human body? Amorphous silica, these are all various crystal structures of SiO2, and yet they differ widely in their degree of pathological harm they can do to tissue. Amorphous silica is mostly inert, glass. You don't worry about it. The others in order of toxicity that you see there, but we really don't know why that crystal structure has any relevance to the degree of reaction of this with lung tissue and so forth. There are interesting comments about free radicals on freshly fractured surfaces. Typically, freshly fractured surfaces are much worse than aged surfaces. And there's also comments, and I could have put up lots of this. I have numbers of papers on it, but I just want to emphasize how little we actually know. There are numbers of hypotheses, but the community, I don't think, has accepted any one of them as being the reason why silica is so harmful to lung health, can lead to silicosis and possible lung cancer. So these are all comments that I've taken out of the literature. And some other problems which I think we can avoid in the nanotechnology world is to do the experimental studies on better characterized samples, and that as we've kind of seen through some of the presentations over this workshop, and it's true here that several types of interactions can occur so that the specific biological responses are hard to pin down. But just to reiterate, this is a problem that we've seen people die from over many years. I mean, this is much worse than anybody being exposed to nanomaterials. There are many deaths that have resulted from silicosis, and yet we don't understand why. Be an interesting discussion. The other one I wanted to talk about is this idea of measurement uncertainty. And I put up this slide because I found it interesting, and a colleague of mine has talked to me about it. This was a Nuclear Regulatory Commission report from 1975. What they were trying to do was prove the safety of nuclear reactors. And I don't worry too much about what exactly the axes mean over here. What they were trying to get at was that the deaths from nuclear power plants, the predicted risk from nuclear power plants, was significantly less than that from all these other possible causes of problems or accidents and so forth. Well, as it turns out, a number of years after they put out this report, they retracted it. And why did they retract it? Because, as it turns out, you notice there are no error bars on here. They published this as though they knew with certainty that this was the answer, and there are uncertainty bands associated with all of these curves here. And so that really is a concern and a message, and I just wanted to go a little further with respect to perhaps how this might apply then to our science of nanomaterials. And at one of the workshops we had, Dr. Don Ewart from ASO Bio, I think, expressed the idea of risk in a way that I appreciated anyway. And he defined risk as a function of both exposure and hazard. So in his definition, and I'm sort of paraphrasing what he said, is risk is the probability that a substance will produce harm under specified conditions of exposure. And the exposure being defined as contact with the compound, and the hazard is the potential for the compound to produce harm. So what isn't in here then is how well do we know the probability of exposure or the probability of hazard. And so I thought, okay, can I put this in more mathematical terms? And with my colleague Jeffrey Fong at NIST, kind of wrote it in this way, is that risk is the probability of an event times its consequences. And if I can express it that way, then the uncertainty in the risk can be expressed as the coefficient of variation in the measurements of either of those parameters, the coefficient of variation being the standard deviation of the measurement divided by its mean, and then the coefficient of variation of the risk is given by an expression that looks like this. So I can in some way determine the uncertainty in my risk if I know the uncertainty to which I might be exposed plus the uncertainty of the degree of hazard of the compound to which I am exposed. And I can think of it graphically, which I thought was interesting, is that the uncertainty of the risk is some band in here between the uncertainty of the exposure and the uncertainty of the hazard. And you can think of different scenarios where if I know one of these perfectly, so there's no uncertainty, what's my uncertainty in the other parameter? But I thought it was a way, ultra simplistic way of thinking about what is the need for measurement, the knowledge of what my measurements really mean and the band on which I should put my measurement uncertainty, because it does affect how I think about the risk of what I'm doing. And when I was introduced, the comment was made, I work on structural materials like ceramics. Well, you think of ceramics as being brittle and people are concerned about failure. Well, there are ways of predicting the reliability of ceramics over long periods of time, but when you do that, you must take into account my measurement uncertainty because there is a risk, and I need to know how long I am able to use this material under a stress without fear of failure. And it is the ability to apply statistics and the right statistics to this that allows me and allows the designer to be safe in what they do. Finally, one that intrigued me because Dr. Larry Hench presented this at a Nano EHS meeting we had last summer in Vancouver, and it intrigued me as a way of getting from our ability to measure nanomaterials outside, the in vitro measurements of particle size and so forth, to what they might really do in terms of being deleterious to cells. And I'm going to give a simple couple of slide overview. And what he had developed was a way to monitor and quantify the cell processes, cell death, etc., by using a Rahman system. And his goal, and as I mentioned, was to avoid in vivo tests because you could do these outside of an animal experiment or something. It would give you a guide to what you needed to do next without going through a lot of animal studies. And the Rahman measurement kind of looks like this. Those of you who know, it's simply a spectrum and gives you some measure of the chemistry of the material you're looking at. But the beauty here is that looking at these two sets of lung epithelium cells, that the Rahman spectrum of the dead cells compared to the Rahman spectrum of the viable cells were quite different. You could measure these with the change in peak area. So it was just an intriguing measurement that perhaps we need to bridge from our common measurements of particle size and shape and so forth to get a feeling of which of these materials is going to be particularly harmful. So I think rapid measurements and avoidance of a lot of these animal testing schemes might be very useful. So with that, let me summarize a bit and then maybe have some discussion. So I want to make the point, there are lots of efforts going on to develop measurement technology. There's no question there. Both as formal and informal standards, the world is concerned about safety of nanomaterials, and there's a large effort being put into doing this. I think that when we do this, that we better be sure we know how well we can make the measurements and what the uncertainty bands, what the standard deviations are, the real standard deviations are, and so forth are in making this and determining the risk of any of the materials we're looking at. And obviously, I said it earlier that one of the critical parameters, but I come back to it because I think it's so important, is that detailed knowledge of the reaction mechanisms between nanomaterials and tissue are going to be critical to developing safe procedures. And expanding on that a bit, it's this kind of meeting. I mean, I've heard it said in meetings where it's only ceramists and so forth, we really need the biologists, we really need the physicians. The two communities are not going to be able to do this alone. It is going to require teamwork between the biological or medical profession and the inorganic materials people to really do the job in developing the measurements that are going to be required to develop these safe procedures. And I certainly believe that better computation and modeling techniques are going to be needed to accelerate the process of development of safe materials and accelerate the development of the measurements themselves. And again, in the same light, this idea of going from in vitro to in vivo as quickly as possible, we really don't know. I mean, I'm convinced from my looking at what happens with crystalline silica that we can make all the measurements we want on the outside and characterize the heck out of those particles, and we will not be able to tell why one particle is harmful and the other one is not. So I strongly suggest this. And then so finally, let me just acknowledge a number of my colleagues, both at NIST and elsewhere, who have helped me put this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciated hearing about the progress that's been made in generating the standards for some of the materials and some of the processes. Could you say something about how quickly, in either your experience or study, once those standards are effected, how quickly they become common practice in the broader research community?
I don't know. I mean, it's a very good question. So there's a standard out there. How soon does not just the research community, but the industrial community, and maybe Mark can talk more about that than I can, because he's the one that uses these.
I'll wait till 4 o'clock, trust me.
Yeah, okay. There you go. You're going to get your answer later.
Okay. Of course, Angie, I know Stephanie out in Colorado, and kudos to them both for working. This is a very tough nut to crack. The one thing that I will put up there where I really would like to see a standard and actually a technique vetted is around surface area, because nitrogen surface area, everyone knows that depends on, you've got these nitrogen molecules that are absorbing on a surface, and anyone who studied fractals knows that you're only as good as your ruler. And if your ruler is this big and your surface has all these little indentations in it, it's not going to pick that up. So I don't know what's being done in that area. I just was curious if that's on the horizon. I know I go to as many of these meetings as you do. But,
more.
Yeah.
So. No, I doubt I can tell you what the effort is because it's too spread out. But I think there is work going on surface area, but exactly who and where I can't tell you.
There's a lot of work going on in the soil science community because of that problem. I have a question for you, but maybe for other people here too. I talked about geoparticles, and one thing that we've been discussing here is, particles that get released, but we're not intentionally releasing them to the environment. We may be using them for something, but we're not specifically trying to modify the environment by releasing them. There's this whole field of geoengineering where, for example, people released huge quantities of iron oxide nanoparticles into the ocean to look and see how that affected carbon dioxide cycling. We've got geoengineering going on where people are releasing particles into the environment to see clouds. People are now talking about geoengineering with nanoparticles to alter the climate change, again, through radiation absorbance. So if we're talking about now already happening and in the future, enormous quantities of nanoparticles being released on purpose, who regulates that? A lot of this has been done internationally, and it's been done with basically no regulation. And then what kind of standards do we need to put in place that if an enormous amount of nanoparticles are purposely released, what's the standard that they're using for measurement, for quality control, for all those things?
I don't know. Chuck may be able to talk about this from the EPA or NIOSH point of view. I don't know.
I can offer a little bit of insight. And EPA believes they have jurisdiction for that, but there's a real conflict within EPA because they see the benefit of experimenting with engineered nanomaterial systems for remediation and cleanup, but at the same time they don't know the implications and the ramifications of that. So there's a lot of activity going on under TSCA to try to reevaluate these materials before they're on the market, but in some cases they're already on the market, and I don't know what the real plan is for that. Certainly there's a big challenge for all of us in the detection and measurement arena to have better methods to be more specific and to be more sensitive for the detection. And EPA is right in front with everybody on trying to figure that out. Now that's about as much as I really know about what's going on at EPA because NIOSH and EPA partner on a number of projects, but I know that they're working rather quickly and aggressively, but in their own separate compartmentalized manner. You've got TSCA, FIFRA, Clean Air Act, water quality, and it maybe what'll come out of all that is a more organized and coordinated front. We hope that would happen.
How much does that impact things that are international? So if a group of international scientists are going to go out and dump particles into the ocean, and a couple of U.S. scientists are involved, but it's mostly led by France and some other countries, who gets involved in that?
I think that's for someone who knows a lot more about our various treaty organizations. And we get involved with some of our treaty organizations through the World Health Organizations, the International Labor Office, and some of the United Nations work that we are doing. But it really doesn't touch upon that sort of the governance of those types of activities.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? I have a question. you addressed this issue about how nanoparticles can affect a living cell. And you used micro-Rahman in order to detect a change between live cells and dead cells. But, and the idea is to get away from small animal models or animal models because they're expensive, it's hard. But the trouble is, it's all about the system. It's not just about a single cell. And so consider this circumstance where that cell is buried beneath a mucus layer. And so therefore, don't you have to put a mucus layer over the cell in order to really indicate how the system is going to respond to that nanoparticle? It's more complicated than just, you know, a nifty micro-Rahman signal, because I have to take into account the cell's total environment and the other cells around that environment, how they respond to the nanoparticle.
I thought of it only as a bridge, and you know, in between something that was purely external and something that you're going to have to go to, but nothing more than that. It's a guide. You know, that I like the idea of these rapid experiments. I always like the, you know, so if there's a way to get there and give you a pathway at least, then it's kind of a combinatorial chemistry approach to getting to the heart of the problem.
I agree with you. It would be great to have a rapid measurement, but I point out that in science, I think in 2007 or so, Pacific Bio Science, I think, published a paper in which they related gene expression in the lung tissue to gene expression in the kidneys and in muscle tissue. What this means is that your whole body is challenged and each tissue responds in a different way. Can you imagine the complications involved? So you have to somehow identify the most important tissue, the most sensitive tissue, and then attack that in a systems from a systems approach.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.